Hi, everyone. Welcome to Collection Spotlight. So thrilled to have everybody here. My name is Beth McLaughlin, and I'm Artistic Director and Chief Curator at Fuller Craft Museum. I'd like to welcome everyone here for our very first Collection Spotlight program. Thank you all for joining us. I'm here today with ceramic artist Syd Carpenter, who has graciously agreed to be our very first guest as we launch this monthly series. So welcome, Syd, and thank you for being here. Collection Spotlight will take place on the second Wednesday of every month at 4 o'clock. This program was conceived as a way to provide increased access to the objects in our permanent collection, to offer insights about the talented artists who created them, and to stimulate new ways of looking at museum collections. So how it's going to go is I'm going to say a few words to start. I'll introduce Syd, then we'll hear from her about her creative practice and the work in our collection. She and I will then chat for a little bit, and then we'll open it up for Q&A from the audience. So please feel free to put any questions you have in the chat function for a little later on. And I also wanted to note that we are recording this program, and we will have it available at a later date on our YouTube channel. For those of you who are new to Fuller Craft, our mission is to provide meaningful discovery of contemporary craft through exhibitions, collections, education, and public programs. We are committed to challenging perceptions and building appreciation of the material world. Our purpose is to inspire, stimulate, and enrich an ever-expanding community. And if you're interested in learning more about us, about what we do, what we offer, or becoming a member, please visit our website at fullercraft.org. Our permanent collection is comprised of over 800 objects in the main craft media categories of wood, metal, fiber, glass, and ceramics. We also have objects made with more unexpected materials of found objects, plastics, polymer, and more. It is ever changing with new additions made every year. And I'd like to thank all of the artists and the donors who have helped us to build the collection over the years, along with our staff, collections committee members, and our board of trustees. I'd also like to recognize the Mass Cultural Council and our local cultural councils for supporting the Collection Spotlight series. And I'd like to thank everyone here in the room with us today for joining us, especially our board members that we have here, our museum educators, and our staff who are all on the call. So now let's turn our attention to the star of the show, our featured guest, Syd Carpenter. Syd is a Philadelphia artist whose current sculpture series focuses on African American farming and gardening. Her work is included in the permanent collections of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Renwick Gallery, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, the James A. Michener Museum of Art, the Tang Museum of Skidmore College, and Fuller Craft Museum, as well as numerous public and private collections. She has been a recipient of the Pew Fellowship in the Arts, the National Endowment for the Arts Grants, the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts Fellowships, Leeway Fellowships in the Arts, and the Center for Established Emerging Artists. She is currently a professor of studio art at Swarthmore College, where she teaches drawing and ceramics. Syd is also featured in a solo exhibition titled Portraits of Our Places at the James A. Michener Museum that is on view, I believe. I'm not sure if they're open. Syd can illuminate us on that, but it is open through February 2021. She also will be a demonstrating artist at the upcoming NCCA conference, discussing her series, Places of Our Own, Portraits of African American Farms. Syd and I first met back in 2016 when she was featured in the Fuller Craft exhibition, Faces of Politics and Tolerance, that was curated by the brilliant Bruce Hoffman. Her sculptures were such an important part of that exhibition, and I was thrilled beyond belief when we were able to accession one of them for our collection. This work, which is titled Irwin and Cornelius Hollyfield, was recently included in the museum exhibition Shelter Place Social Distance, which examined collection objects through the lens of the pandemic. And I'm just so happy to have her here with us today. So welcome, Syd, and thank you for being here. You're muted, Syd.
Hi, Beth. I just want to thank you for inviting me to be a part of this series. It's been an honor, of course, to have my work included in the Fuller Craft Museum collection. So this is just one of those events that just kind of connects me even more to the museum itself. So, and I also want to thank all of you who have joined us this afternoon to give up your afternoon on this kind of cold and wintry day. So I thought that in light of the fact that it's so wintry, that I would start off talking about gardens. And so I'm going to share my screen here and get us started. Okay, let me just go back a little bit. Okay, there we are. Can everyone see? Okay, all right, great. So I thought I would begin with thinking about how I landed in a place where gardens became so important to me. And it has to do with these two women. The person on the left is my mother, Ernestine Carpenter, and on the right is Indiana Hudson. And Ernestine is my mother and Indiana being my grandmother. And both of these women were very avid gardeners. My grandmother on this side here that you're seeing, she was someone who had a garden that was celebrated in Pittsburgh. It was an important place for her because it was a place where she was able to provide food for her family, as well as be able to sell some of the produce that she was able to grow. And so that legacy of my grandmother being a gardener and my mother also being a gardener has been something that's just been informing my practice for many, many years. And it's this whole idea of women in the garden, African-American women in the garden. And what did that look like? Who were those people? So I was doing research around that because I was gardening. I am a gardener. And it's something that has fueled my artwork for decades now. So here I am in front of my garden. I garden in Philadelphia in an area that is known for its gardens. And so my presence in that garden, in that area, was something that made me want to think about, well, who else was doing this and what was the history of it? But before I go on with that, I'll just show you the garden because it has been the basis, it's been the inspiration of so much of what I've done. And so this is gardening at my residence over many years. It's an ornamental garden rather than growing food. I use it as a second studio. In addition to working with clay, I feel that my second medium is working with plants and dealing with space, color, texture, something that you would see in the landscape. So it's constantly changing. It's something that's a challenge to me, but also something that brings me a lot of joy, which is something that I saw and witnessed in my own mother, is the joy that being in the garden brought to her. So I grow primarily annuals. I grow perennials. And like I said, not enough food, but there's some herbs that have crept in there as well. But it's something that I think about and I plan for every year, along with working with the forms that I produce in clay. But the idea of designing this space and finding different plants over the years has been something that is simultaneously happening when I'm dealing with what kind of forms I'm going to create in the garden, in my studio. So here are some pieces that have been directly influenced by the garden itself. Right now, when you're looking at these earlier pieces, they're not so much about specific places or specific people, which is what the later work does do. It does engage with specific people. But I'm interested in the movement of the plants themselves. So this series of pieces that you're looking at, they're all about 6 feet in length. So there's some size to them. That's important to me because the size reflects my own bodily proportions. I'm not 6 feet tall, but within there's this physicality that I like. And so you can see that there are elements that generally are reflective of plant forms, like a bud, like a twisted stem, but also there's some elements that refer to human intervention, like the wheel and the body and the bottle and the ring. Okay, this is a large piece that was installed at the convention center in Philadelphia. It's called Inner Workings, and it definitely makes reference to plant forms and things that I saw in my own garden. And I was interested in, obviously, the movement, the kind of muscularity. It's kind of a subtle movement. You know, plants don't show you how they're moving. They do, and you notice it, and you observe it, and you can see the changes. So I was interested in that. These 2 pieces are once again in that kind of 5 to 6 feet range in terms of their size. You know, one on the right is called Germinating Seed, and the other one is about a kind of plant that we all see out in the woods. They're called lianas, and they're vines that twist around other plants, but they gain their strength and their muscularity from their dependence on other forms. But this is just the liana itself. This is a familiar figure. Blood ties. And this is a self-portrait that I did called 4 Seasons of Interest. So it shows on the far left part what looks like a flower or a black flower, but actually it's also representing blood cells. That's the shape of a blood cell. And then there's my head as a vessel, and the brain, and then a stem. And this is from a series that I did that had to do with expanded leaves, because leaves are flat. But if you imagine them and you think about them in terms of volumetric form, if you were to, in other words, if you were to take a leaf and just blow into it the way you would into a balloon, what would that look like? And that's what this group of pieces that I did represented, was that if I took something that was flat that was in the garden and expanded it, I'd get something that felt very animal-like and bestial even. So this is a piece called Merge. Once again, thinking about expanded leaves, movement. And that's always an important part of my work, is this issue of making sure that the objects are in some kind of configuration that represents the potential for movement and change. So this is the piece that is at the Fuller right now. And it is an actual portrait of a place that I visited, because the idea was for me to discover just what this source for, or at least where were my own roots in terms of gardening and farming, and finding out about the history of African-American farms and gardens, because it's not a story that's necessarily told. It's something that I feel it has to be unearthed. There are records, there are photographs of African-American farmers, but the representation in actual visual art is something that's a little bit more rare. And it had to do with the fact that during the Great Migration, when so many African-Americans left the South to move north to find a better life, the goal was to abandon that connection and that association to something that was seen as negative. So the connection to the land was not seen as something to be proud of. But my journey into this, my investigation of it had to do with finding those folks who stayed on the land. Because to me, that too was a gesture, at least a stance of courage to actually stay there and endure some of the burdens and some of the obstacles that were put before African-American farmers and gardeners. So I started doing this series of portraits of farmers and gardeners, and this is from that series. And they took on a kind of life of their own, so to speak, in terms of what I was representing. I always wanted to have a part that suggested the presence on the land of people, of occupants. So there's always some kind of architectural form. So you can see in this piece that there is that box, that geometry that represents a certain kind of architecture, but the rest are planting holes, stems, branches, those kinds of things, the texture of the land. And this would be something that I would have observed at that place. But actually this particular image was taken from maps that I discovered of African-American farms and gardens by Richard Westmacott. And he had done these very, very intricate and detailed maps of farms. And so these were my reaction to his farms or to his drawings. It wasn't something that I was trying to replicate. In fact, these became very improvisational as I started building them. So more of them, just taking elements and extrapolating them and building upon them. And that was the goal of making each one of these farms. And in terms of dimension, they were usually about 24 to 27 inches, and they were landscapes. Sometimes they often appeared on the wall, but for the most part, they were about the land. They were about the elements that I noticed and wanted to feel, to create some kind of structural representation of a fence, of a clod of earth, a tool, something like that. But it's always in service to the sculpture itself. So the sculpture has demands that may circumvent the specificity of a particular place, but it's always me reacting and using these prompts from looking at these diagrams. And so here's another one. And it's important that you notice that there is a clothespin in this one. And the clothespin becomes a very, very important component of a later series, which I will show you. And you can see my interest in texture and movement still is present and very important in these pieces. The colors that you're seeing are not only representative of the earth, but also the representative of the color of the skin of the people that I was describing, or at least documenting their places. I graduated, if you will, onto working with pieces that were freestanding. So this is Albert and Albert Howard. They were two farmers that they were twins, and they have the same name, except one is spelled with an E and one is spelled with an A. And they were twins who were cattle farmers. And this is an object that I created to talk about the fact that they are these tandem individuals that create and are able to sustain this place that they had created. Another view of that. And these are images that are taken from the installation at the Michener Museum, which is up until the end of February. And this is Mary Howard in the forefront here. And what I noticed, I visited Mary's garden along with Albert and Albert's ranch. And Mary is the wife of one of the twins. Don't pin me down on which one, because I just know that she's married to one of the Alberts. And one of the things that I saw when I traveled to the South to look at these different farms was at her farm, she had this beautiful steel gliding seat in her garden. And it was important for me to take note of what I saw and noticed at each one of these places. And it's similar to my reaction to the Richard Westmacott maps. Those were things that he noticed and I extrapolated upon. Going to the farms, and I went to 3 states, South Carolina, Georgia, and then to the Gullah Islands, which are right off the coast of South Carolina, and took a lot of photographs and interviewed folks, and just came back with this treasure trove of imagery, which is still something that is fueling my work. This trip happened in 2012, but I'm able to continue sourcing imagery and content from all of that material that I was able to collect. So this is Sarah Reynolds. She had an organic farm on one of the Gullah Islands as well. And the bench is something that I saw in a field on her farm, and the cart and the baskets and the fruit. So in looking at this series of pieces, it's clay on the top. You can see which ones are parts are clay. And then the rest of it is steel, which is something that I thought was important to me in terms of its materiality, of course, but also the idea that these pieces would normally either go on the wall or would go on a pedestal. But I thought by creating these steel pedestals themselves, I could extend the narrative of what was going on and get even more information. And also because the steel itself had some kind of resonance in terms of what I saw on these farms, the use of the different tools, just the hardware that you notice, and also the color of the earth. This was a piece that I saw in Atlanta, Georgia, and it's the farm of Rashid Nori. And Rashid Nori is one of the African-American farmers who was addressing in Atlanta the idea of food desert. So he had lots of these gardens around the Atlanta, Georgia area. This one in particular was close to the Ebenezer church that was the church of Martin Luther King. And it was about a block away from it. But it was also on the site of a demolished high-rise apartment building. So the garden was planted among the ruins of the demolished building. So there were stairways that led nowhere, pathways and trenches. All of this was still there as an artifact around which this garden, which always to me represents growth and rebirth. So I love the contrast between the demolished residence and the rebirth of this site as a garden, which was adjacent to the Martin Luther King Church. This also was a garden that I saw that was a beautiful organic garden that also housed a museum for antique kitchenware. And so combining this element with the actual clay and creating the landscape, that to me was the sculptural challenge to see what would happen. So the bottom is one of their buildings. The crisscrosses represent some of the tools that were there. And so you see the top where there's a plate of food. Once again, the clothespin appears, the structure, the architecture appears, and of course, all on a bed of earth. So back again to my mom, Ernestine, who I attribute so much of my love of gardening. She herself was an artist. So everything coming from this, to me, woman who I idolize. And in the next body of work, I also create a certain kind of mythology around her in a series that I call the Mother Pins. And it has to do with the fact that I still own my mother's bag of clothespins, the clothespins that she hung my clothes and the family's laundry on the line in our backyard. So I wanted to create a series that commemorated her by using the clothespin as a representation of her as this being that was able to provide for me in so many ways, just giving me confidence as an artist, the permission. I just remember that I had been accepted and invited to go to the University of Pennsylvania as a pre-med. And there was the choice, do I go to art school or do I go to the University of Pennsylvania to become a doctor? And of course, for a young Black woman in the early 70s to be able to make those choices was pretty heady stuff. And I remember my mother not having any objection to my choice to become an artist. It was about her encouraging me to be what I felt would be essential to me. Of course, the idea and the status of a young Black woman being a doctor, that was something that was a possibility. But I just remember my mother being so encouraging and so supportive of that choice. And so it's just been my response to her over the years has been to celebrate her as this extraordinary person. And so here is the series of mother pins. The mother pins are usually about 30 inches high, so you get a sense of scale in these. This is mother pin a fire. Mother pin a wash. Mother pin and a plate of beans. Mother pin with basket. And this is an ongoing series. Whatever else I'm making, I'm continuing to make the mother pins. And I think this is the last mother pin. This one is about this is about 4 feet across. Mother pin as a storage jar. And I'm using a lot of mixed media in these: glass, steel, wood, and of course, lentils. So this is the last series of images I'm going to show you. In line with gardening, I was invited along with my husband to design a garden in the back of the Woodmere Museum in Philadelphia. And the form of the garden is what we refer to as a hugel. It's an ancient planting technique in which you dig out a trench, which is what I'm standing in, as you can see. And then the trench, I think, is filled with debris, natural debris, usually logs, and you start layering the logs with leaves and other kind of organic debris. And eventually you build earth on top of it. The logs that you're seeing in front of you, those are going to be tiles that are going to be laid in place around the hugels themselves. But the continuing of the layering. And the logs themselves will eventually begin to break down and provide nutrients to whatever is growing on top of them. But the idea was to create, for me, was to create these sculptural forms that engage that landscape. We're on top of a hill, and as you move towards the right, there are trees and a forest and a valley. But this would be a destination point when you're walking up the hill towards the museum, and you would arrive in this hugel garden. So eventually the hugels will be planted. This is similar. This is kind of the kind of plantings that we're thinking of putting on top of the hugel. So we come back to gardening always. It's my source, and everything is integrated and blended through the language of the garden and how I can interpret it sculpturally. So that's that. So if anybody has any questions about that, I'm very, very happy to respond.
Well, Sid, that was so fantastic. Thank you so much. I find all of your work incredibly compelling and such a really remarkable conflation of material and meaning and skill and aesthetic beauty. And thank you for sharing that with us. And
No, that was my pleasure. Thank you.
yeah, and I find it one thing that really strikes me about your work in ceramics, particularly the farm portraits, is this beautiful and almost ancient connection between clay that's pulled from the earth and then used to create these homages or these portraits of land and of the fecundity of the earth. I'm sure you've been asked that before. Do you have any further insights you want to share about your use of clay and kind of the meaning and the power behind using clay for the specific body of work?
Well, I started out as a painter, as many clay artists do, going to art school to primarily paint in the European tradition, because that's all that had been presented to me. That was art with a capital A. And because I was fairly able in that genre, I could draw, I could paint, I could make things look nice. But for me as an artist, it was very thin, because there was always the underlying sense that this is not real for me. So I took some clay classes with Rudolph Staffel. I don't know if any of your audience are familiar with him. He's iconic in the field. And his approach to teaching was not to expound on what he thought was important. It was giving his students permission to find their own source of importance. And so in taking his classes, there was a very non-judgmental approach to what you were making, as long as you really wanted to make it. As long as it wasn't imitative of something else, we could have a conversation about it. So for me, working with clay was that first opportunity to feel that I could find my own visual language in this.
Yeah.
Not to say that I wasn't tracking along traditional paths, because that's how you learn, but it became the medium in which I found an opportunity to delve into some kind of truths. I could make unsuccessful things that didn't look like models of what ceramic art was supposed to look like, and still get a response. Someone would say, it looks like this, or why did you do that? And so I got the feeling that in working with clay, I could construct a visual language for myself. I just had to work at it long enough until those ideas started to come. And so over the decades, I have come to a place where I can say, oh, that's my truth in this material.
Yeah. Yeah. And in fact, we had a question in the chat about your clay process while we're on the subject. Sharon asked, can you say something about your clay process, low fire, high fire? It looks like you use some natural coloring or raku. Is there any further info you can share?
Sure. In the farm portraits, I'm using a mid-range clay that fires to about cone 6. because I want the pieces to many of the pieces to go outside. Ultimately, that whole series of steel sculptures, steel with clay, needs to be outside because I see them as a garden. And so I'm using a clay that can withstand cold temperatures, hot temperatures, and some of them, the ones with steel have no surfaces on them. The earlier ones that I described as being the skin of the people I described, that I am no longer using standard surfaces. In fact, I'm using graphite on top of the clay. And so those pieces would not go outside. But the polished graphite to me is just such a silky, beautiful surface. So I apply graphite to the clay and polish it up at the end.
Okay. It is luscious, that's for sure. Um, and I wanted to ask you a few questions about your work with the farms. And I know that there's been some media attention paid to the decline in African American farming. And I wonder if that played into your decision to create these series of portraits as a way of creating awareness or memorializing these farms that are so important. And also how it was working with the farmers and how you approached them, what was the response?
Yes, that was a major prompt because when I started doing the series, of course, the research told me that there was a major decline, from the turn of the 20th century when there were 20 million acres under cultivation by African Americans till now. So there's only 2% of the farming on the actual rural states and in rural locations. There are only 2% African American farmers. But what's so wonderful about this is that when we did move north, one of the things, even though we prioritized modernity and urban life, we made gardens. We came into these cities and we made gardens in abandoned lots in our backyards. My grandmother was one of those. Indiana created a garden on a corner and became well known for how beautiful it was. I'm told this by my aunt, who was her daughter, obviously, and who had to work in that garden. So it was an important component. The fact that there was this dire prediction that there would no more, the African American farms were on the decline. Well, you don't have to look very far, especially in urban settings, to see that African Americans are at the forefront of the movement for urban gardens. I mean, I could name names of so many amazing, inventive, creative, resourceful organizers of urban farmers, and they're bringing that knowledge from their history and their past. So there may be fewer, let's say, in rural areas, but it's exponential in terms of how many people are creating farms and gardens in urban centers, and that the leaders of those urban centers are African American. And so I've also found that there is a little uptick in people returning to family farms in the South. So the idea, the notion that it's going to be, there's this extinction going on, it's not true. And the other issue is that now in this time of climate change and the need for us to pay attention to sustainable practices in terms of producing food, the return to the land is now considered something that has status. That if you are lucky enough to still have the farm in your family, that's status now. And a lot of African Americans who went north and got degrees, MBAs, became doctors and lawyers, are thinking about that farm on the Gullah Islands, are back on that farm. And so there's an organization called the Southern African American Organic Network, where it's just farms by African Americans who are doing organic farming. And they have a whole list farms that you can visit. So there's called the Agri-Tour. I don't know if you're aware of it,
Oh,
but you can take trips and you can visit farms throughout the South and the North as well, but primarily in the South, and just go visit all of these amazing, beautiful places that are gardening sustainably.
oh, wow. So, how did you get in touch with the farmers then that you visited? What was that process like? And
Well, it was through the Southern African American Organic Network.
okay,
I contacted them, and they were able to provide me with a map, a list of names. And a friend of mine who's another artist, her name is Helen Ramsaran. She and I met in Atlanta, Georgia, rented a car, and started driving this route. And it was just amazing because we were able to make appointments, and we had to make an appointment because these folks are busy. They don't have time for you just showing up and talking. So
expecting a
we
tour.
would make, yeah, so we would have this schedule. We've got to be on, Sarah Reynolds farm by 3 o'clock because she's got an hour. And we've got to be, at the Albert and Albert's farm by 10 o'clock the next morning because they've got a field to plow. So it was just this kind of wonderful intensity and meeting them and talking to them, and just I taped them and filmed them as well. But it was just kind of an amazing encounter with my own past and history, as well as the reality of who's still on the land, who's a steward of the land.
Yeah. Wow. And then the footage, I know you have some of it on YouTube. Is that right? So if people wanted to go and view
Yeah, I
some of the
think that,
film.
yeah, some of that stuff is up. I think
Yeah.
so. Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
talking about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't visited myself, so it's been a while. But
Yeah.
yeah, I have footage of folks talking.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then, I'm curious because I know we've talked about your work as is situated in social activism. And I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about that, but also your thoughts on gardening as social activism, in particular, your own work in the garden.
Well, in terms of activism, it has to do with support, acknowledgement, um, participation on my part. The fact that, right now I'm involved in 4 gardens, 3 of which are public. And I think my presence, along with the presence of so many other dedicated practitioners itself, it's a statement about self-awareness, self-determination, a commitment to community. I mean, these are all things, and it's about um, learning to see and value what's really, really important in a time, and learning to focus. I mean, there's a certain kind of there's obviously pleasure in gardening, but there's also a level of defiance in gardening as well.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm reading a book now called Defiant Gardens, which I highly recommend, which talks about where gardens appear in the most unlikely places and how humans have always gravitated towards it. It's a go-to when you are in threatening or uncertain circumstances. So the idea of making a garden in an unlikely place, to me, is something that is really, really riveting. The idea that you're creating this managed space, and the outcome of which you have no idea what the outcome is, because it's so much about the process.
Yeah.
Gardening is about process, with some outcomes that can work and often do not work. I mean, you're putting yourself in collaboration with nature, which, it sounds kind of cliches, but, the more you can connect with that, I think that there's more opportunity for peace of mind and connection to where you are and who you are. It's always about sharing. The notion of the secret garden to me is one that I never can get with that,
Yeah.
because I think gardens are going to be public places, and you can only provide a positive gesture to someone else walking through your garden or seeing your garden.
Yeah. Well, and hearing you talk too, I'm thinking of all the connections between gardening that you mentioned and craft and your practice, from using it as a place for healing and for respite to not knowing the outcomes and really enjoying that spontaneity. So I think that's really some beautiful connections to be made there. Um, yeah. And on that note, um, we actually had one other. We have a few more questions, and then we have two components to the collection spotlight that we're going to get to. Um, I just want to get to a few more of these questions. One is, are the pins solid? Can you talk about the mother pins? Someone was wondering about that.
No, the pins are not solid. They are sculpted. They're slab built. So
Okay.
I do have, I sculpted the original pin and then I cast it in plaster a few different sizes and I refined the design of it so I could use it more efficiently. But no, all of that is hollow slab work.
Okay. And then we had another process question. At the times where you deviated from the clay body, how did you make decisions about what other media to use? And did you collaborate with other artists?
No, there was no collaboration, and it's always about trial and error, trying things. I didn't have a vision of what these things had to be. So I just embarked on uh, just a period of just trying out all kinds of surfaces, trying out ways of applying surfaces. So you have to just go through that period. I mean, you have to be, and I say this to my students all the time, you have to be willing to make something ugly.
Hmm.
You have to be willing to know that something is going to fail. I love glorious failure. To me, that is more valuable than tried and true success. So I just embarked on just a long period of glorious failures. And I should say that the glorious failures are ongoing. You're only seeing the things that seem to have worked.
Yeah.
There is a whole graveyard of things that are sitting there waiting to be either recycled or redone. But you have to be willing to accept that this is not a done deal. If everything succeeds and if it all looks good right away, what is that? What does that mean? Are you relaxing into some kind of comfort zone? So it's and I don't even have favorite um, tools or anything like that. I know there's this question about what's your favorite tool. I never know. Each series requires a level of invention. You
Hmm.
start all over. For me, I mean, I'm building on skill and experience, obviously, but new questions, new threats, because it's threatening in the studio for me anyway. I don't know about other folks, but the studio represents it's a space where things could go really wrong or really well, but it's for me, it's going in there and seeing what's going to happen.
Yeah. Wow. And that glorious failure, I love that so much. And I think it's a philosophy that you can apply in many different aspects of your
Oh,
life.
absolutely.
I'm going to
If
be
you're not,
thinking about that.
yeah, if you're not willing to fail, you're not going in.
Yeah,
And so
that's
it's
right.
for an artist, you've got to go in
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
risk failure and
Yeah.
wish and the more glorious the failure, the better. I tell my students as long as they don't burn the place down or hurt somebody, go for it.
Wow, that's great. Okay, so one aspect of every collection spotlight that I'm hoping to include is asking the featured guests to select a work from our permanent collection that is not their work, that a work that particularly resonates with them, because I think it's really important to offer other perspectives on the work that's in the collection and really gather other people's viewpoints, whether it's curatorial viewpoint or another artist or both. So I'm going to, if you can all bear with me, share my screen to show you the work that Sid has selected. Whoops. And it's Roberto Lugo's Melting Pot 2. So Sid, tell us why you selected Roberto Lugo's Melting Pot 2.
Well, I'll begin by saying I'm very much a fan of Roberto Lugo's work, um, and also of the man himself. Just the various levels of engagement as an artist, as an activist, all of these things that he manages to be so effective at. So, in looking at this piece, I see it as exemplary of a kind of approach that a lot of artists of color or marginalized artists have adapted. And that's the idea of taking a genre of work, in this case, Chinese porcelain, and reassigning its identity. So in this case, you see a Chinese porcelain, and you're thinking about this kind of 12th to 16th century period where the Chinese were masters of porcelain, and they were creating these unbelievable forms that became highly sought after, and of course were emblems and objects of status. To own a Chinese porcelain, it became ubiquitous. The blue and white Chinese ginger jar, which is what this object is evocative of. So you have in the painting world, you have Kehinde Wiley, who does portraits of African Americans as Napoleon Bonaparte, or as taking on that guise, taking on that kind of grandiose representation, and replacing the star of the show. In that case, it would have been Napoleon. But now an urbanized young Black male is on the horse rather than Napoleon. So here we have Roberto Lugo as a ceramicist, taking on Chinese porcelain. And I have, there's a complexity around this that really interests me. Here he is appropriating, if you will, and it's an appropriation of this iconic object, this porcelain piece with the decoration. And you can see that he's quite skillful. He's able to apply the different kinds of markings and patterns. And so the spirit of this thing is clearly there. If you have any information or awareness of what is considered high art within these cultures, then here it is. But now he has taken it and created this appropriated suggestion of not necessarily disdain, but he's adapting and borrowing on the status of this object. And in doing so, he's replaced the general, or at least the expected cliched images, but now he's showing us Ice Cube, a rapper, and Julia de Burgos, who's a poet, a Puerto Rican poet. And those images are now placed on this iconic jar. And also his hands are the lid with pattern on them. And then, of course, there's that recognizable gesture of the graffiti artist, something that is immediate, fast, and in a certain way, it accosts, or it confronts the surface that upon which it is applied. It's something that is vaguely disruptive but declarative. It tells you, I'm here over this thing. Now, for me, the interesting conflict here is that these pieces are clearly recognizable as Chinese porcelain. The verticality, the decoration, it's there. There is this indomitable presence of this culture. And the way he's painted it, it's very, very just definitive. in what this is. You will never not know what this is. Now, in contrast, I'm looking at the way he has painted the figures and also the graffiti markings. To me, there is a delicacy, even an impermanence there. And so that makes these objects that much more mysterious to me and questionable to me. So the identity of them is such that the images that are superimposed over these very, very declarative, iconic figures, there's a sense of their, not temporary, but there's the sense that I'm here and I'm taking up this space. I've painted some graffiti across the bottom, but still that iconic form is still dominant. So whether or not there is this, in terms of the appropriation, there is some tension and strife between the object and the superimposition of these images. So that's why I'm interested in Melting Pot, because I'm seeing the melt is not confirmed.
Oh,
So that's what I'm thinking about.
wow. Well, thank you so much for that incredible, all your insights and that description. I could not have said it any better myself. I just love hearing your perspective on it. And I'm so glad that you chose it. This is our most recent acquisition, purchased acquisition that was brought into the collection this past August. And we were just very proud of it. So thank you for giving us the opportunity to shine a light on it once again. And then we are just about out of time, but another piece of the collection spotlight that I'm trying to include every time is asking the same series of questions to our guests. Some of you may know this type of format from the James Lipton Inside the Artist Studio. I always thought that was really interesting. So this will also be a great record for us to have in our collection files to get these same responses from artists that we have on this program. So my first question: when did you first realize you wanted to become an artist? And someone had asked a similar question in the chat, so I'm glad we're going to get to this.
Well, I always was an artist. So it was something that was encouraged in my family. So there was no first. I was always drawing, I was making, I was sewing. My mother encouraged it. She was an artist. So it's just always been how I viewed the world, through the lens of making something out of what I was responding to, making stuff. I just like to make stuff all the time.
Yeah. What is your best advice for those starting a career in the arts?
Well, there's that whole idea of the previous question, when did you think you were an artist? And then there's that whole idea of career. Okay, so my sense of that is first know that you're an artist. Don't come at this sideways and say, oh, that looks like a cool thing to do. Yeah. Either you are and you need to be committed to it, and the way you're committed to it is imagine your life without it. So once that is established, then you can start thinking about career. Yeah. And there are things that are in place right now. There is, going to art school, going to grad school, getting into resident, there's this prescriptive path that you can take to build a career. So I just think it's important to be honest with yourself at the beginning. What do you bring to the actual act of making art? I mean, insecurity is one, but also being firmly convinced that if I don't do this, my life will not have addressed what is most important to me. Yeah. So honesty, really. Yeah. But if you're in it career to make money, go elsewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, brilliant advice. What other artists would you like to work with?
Well, I've been lucky. I've actually been working with them. I don't know if she's on this call, but Sana Musa Sama is this amazing artist and world traveler and activist. And I got to do a project with her last summer. And then Martha Jackson Jarvis, who is another phenomenal artist. And I got to work with her to do a proposal for public art. So I could say Zenobia Bailey is one that I haven't worked with, but I would just like young, I would like to do something with her. So that,
I would
this,
love to see that.
yes, yes,
We have
me
to figure
too.
out how to make that happen.
Right. Yeah. Well, she's in Philadelphia now. So I think I can sneak up on her and
Okay,
get something done.
that's great. Well, keep us posted on that. That would be amazing. Yeah. Um, we t- you talked a little bit about this because one of my questions for you is what is your most important tool? Is there anything in the studio you cannot live without?
No,
Yeah.
I don't know until I get there and I have to solve a problem.
Yeah.
There's just, I have lots of tools and it depending upon what I'm doing at the time.
Yeah.
Because if I don't have that versatile tool that handles everything.
Yeah.
I don't.
Got it. And last but not least, what do you want your legacy to be?
Well, the legacy has to do with leaving work behind that still has resonance about what it is to be a woman making art, about an ancestry that had to do with the earth, contributing to the visual record of Black farmers, in this country because of the history of African Americans on the farm and the association that it was only about cotton, rice, and indigo. It wasn't. So if someone at some point can identify a piece that I did that addressed that and called attention to it, and then other artists picked up on that, that would be great.
Well, that's beautiful. And I think a really perfect way to end this incredible program. I just wanted to again thank you, Sid, for being here. Thank you to everybody who was able to join us. Please make sure we have so many incredible virtual programs available. We'll have the collection spotlight every month. Coming up, we have Stacy Lee Weber, who will be on March 10th. We have Silas Kopf and Jay Stanger will be in conversation on April 14th. And we have Jana Zwyman, who will be on May 12th, I believe. And we have great craft chat programs. Tomorrow night, we have our Makers and Mentors, the Art and Life of Snow Farm Artist Talk. So please, everybody, join us for these. And again, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Sid, for sharing your work with us, your talent, your insights, your brilliance. We really just so appreciate it.
No, this was a pleasure for me. I appreciate all of you showing up and listening to me talk about this work. It's an honor. It's truly an honor. Thank you so much, Beth.
You're
And
welcome.
the museum. It was great. The Fuller Museum.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.